I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
July 20th, 1969, and Neil Armstrong makes history as the first man to walk on the moon. Only a few years before, the very idea had seemed impossible, but the crew of America's Apollo 11 had made the incredible journey, and there were live TV pictures to prove it.
Irrespective of the size, that's not universally true. There are a few of the smaller craters around which do not have a discernible rim. The ground mass throughout the Earth.
July 1979, and in the laboratory in Houston, Texas, moon rocks are the everyday objects of analysis for American scientists. In the 10 years separating this from that first moonwalk, the space effort has receded from the world's headlines. The memory of its achievements has faded. The Apollo missions began in 1964 and ended in 1972. During that time, America dazzled the world with its mastery of space technology and, equally important, efficient teamwork. Throughout it all, cameras were there to record every step. On the 10th anniversary, it's worth taking a second look at some of the images that were produced as America turned science fiction into science fact. Previously, the Russians had been ahead in the space race, which began in 1957 with the Sputnik 1 satellite, an unbelievable achievement at the time. A month later, an even bigger satellite carrying the dog Laika was launched. Two Russian attempts to put a man into space failed. Then, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man to ever leave the planet. Gagarin immediately became a national hero, and a new word was born. He had become the world's first ever cosmonaut. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, but the Russians' main effort was devoted not to putting cosmonauts on the moon, but machines. Lunar 13 was equipped with two mechanical arms designed to measure soil density and surface radioactivity. But as the Russians forged ahead, the Americans became increasingly determined to stay in the race. President Kennedy.
And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it.
Many of the Americans' early efforts were dogged by failure, while Russia's satellites were successfully launched and returned to Earth. The Americans were having trouble just getting off the ground. Then, in 1965, Ed White took a 21-minute spacewalk. Again, they had been beaten to it. 3 months earlier, a Russian had amazed the world by leaving his capsule and walking in space. 2 years after his spacewalk, Ed White's Apollo capsule caught fire during countdown, and he died, along with fellow astronauts Virgil Grissom and Roger Chaffee. Although there had been several failures and accidents before, it's surprising there weren't more, considering the sheer enormity of the Moon project. Everything to do with it was larger than life. At Cape Kennedy, the Vehicle Assembly Building soars nearly 200 meters high, reaching literally to the clouds. It's so tall that clouds can actually form at the top in certain weather conditions. It's more than 4 times the size of the United Nations headquarters in New York and covers 8 acres. This view inside the building is just a quarter of it.
We have 2 high bay cranes.
The Americans' ability to think big while still controlling the minute details of space technology all came together on July 16, 1969, when Neil Armstrong, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Collins, and Colonel Edwin Aldrin took the few small steps to board their spacecraft before making that giant leap for mankind. Nearly 3 hours after takeoff, Apollo 11, traveling at over 39,000 kilometers an hour, left the Earth's orbit and was on course for the Moon.
Pro. Pitch over. Pitch over. Huh? And here it is, Gators, Lone Star. Call me the thing, Charlie. Okay, 38 degrees. Right. Helmet on dot, north ray. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Post control, both auto descent. Command override off. Engine arm off.
4 days and 600,000 kilometers later, the voice of Neil Armstrong announced, "The Eagle has landed."
The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far.
After Armstrong's historic first steps, Edwin Aldrin followed him onto the dusty lunar surface. A fifth of the world's population watched the event live on television, while the late Pope Paul VI watched through the Vatican's own telescope.
Beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up.
The launching of the ascent stage from the Moon went as planned, and on board with the 2 astronauts were 22 kilograms of rock samples they had collected during their 2.5 hours on the lunar surface. While the scientists back on Earth eagerly awaited their safe return, Michael Collins lined up his command module ready for docking with his fellow astronauts. After the splashdown, the 3 men who had left the Earth for 8 days had to don isolation garments. There could be no warm embraces from their colleagues and families for fear of lunar contamination. They were kept in isolation for nearly 3 weeks, a precaution which later proved to be unnecessary. All 3 astronauts became major international celebrities. Nearly every country gave extensive coverage of their journey, including the Soviet Union. One of the few exceptions was China, which made no mention of the moon landing and sent no congratulatory message. The rest of the world welcomed the 3 everywhere they went. They were heroes. Just 4 months later, Apollo 12 was heading to the Moon after a launching which could have ended in disaster. The rocket system had been struck by lightning, putting the electrics temporarily out of action. This time, it was Charles Conrad's and Alan Bean's turn to explore the Moon, while Richard Gordon manned the command module. They spent 7.5 hours collecting over 34 kilograms of rocks and setting up 6 experiments, which, with the help of a nuclear-powered battery, had a year's operational life.
And I think I landed at head crater. Almost,
let her down. You level off.
By the time of Apollo 16 in April 1962, the rough lunar surface was becoming a familiar sight to American spacemen. This was the fifth moon landing of the series, but it had to be delayed by 4 hours while technicians back at Mission Control solved a problem with the module's propulsion engines. But all was well, and on April the 20th, the landing was made in the Cayley Plains of the Descartes region. Again, one of the first tasks was to raise the American flag with a supporting arm to keep it stiff in the airless lunar atmosphere.
Off the ground, up more. There we go. Set.
For the first time, an ultraviolet camera spectrograph was set up to photograph the Earth and various galaxies. Through the pictures, scientists were able to learn more about the distribution of hydrogen and other gases in planetary and intergalactic space. Under the direction of Mission Control, Commander John Young and lunar module pilot Charles Duke began collecting the first rock and soil samples and setting up various surface experiments. But more exciting was their use of the moon buggy, the lunar vehicle being used for only the second time and now much improved.
Hey, we come a long way. Hey, John, it's easier to go straight across. That was fun. The old water bag is working super. This is going to be a good day, Charlie.
The first day's drive covered 4.2 kilometers, with the astronauts using seat belts to counteract the exaggerated bucking action in the low lunar gravity, 1/6 of the Earth's. Then Young put the buggy through its paces, accelerating and braking and making sharp turns. He achieved a top speed here of 11.5 kilometers an hour, later reaching 16.3 kilometers an hour. The third day, the buggy took the two men out to the North Ray crater, about 5 kilometers north of the lunar module. The large depression was expected to yield unusual rock samples around its perimeter, and the two astronauts collected an additional 45 kilos, bringing the total to a record 97.5 kilos. They also located some exceptionally large boulders, which caused great excitement among astronauts and mission controllers alike.
We're just right beyond you. And we better press on to the big boulder. Okay, we're headed that way. Okay, that sounds like a good guess. We can see. The closer I get to it, the bigger it is. Yeah, but look at the permanent shadows part, Charlie.
Fantastic. Right here.
If we could see to the bottom, we could say for sure if this big black rock is right out of the bottom. But my guess from the old photographs, it probably is.
And as our crew slowly we bet upon it, disappeared into the sunset.
Ground control then gave the warning that time was running out. The lunar excursion had lasted 5 hours and 40 minutes, with the moon buggy covering another 11.4 kilometers. They drove back to the lunar module as fast as they dared.
You get the tongs, John? Yep. I'll carry the rake. Home again, jiggity jig.
Young and Duke were on the moon outside their craft for a record 20 hours, 14 minutes. They had also driven further and collected more rock samples than their predecessors.
80 feet per second vertical rise.
With complete precision, the lunar module soared back into orbit, where command pilot Ken Mattingly was waiting. The final maneuvers brought the two craft nearer and nearer, anxious minutes for the three men, since the docking maneuver was both difficult and dangerous. But America had mastered this vital skill long ago, and there were no problems.
I think we've seen as much in 10 days as most people see in 10 lifetimes. We really come up here, Tony. It's just spectacular. I have never seen it.
The return journey, too, was trouble-free. On the way, Mattingly climbed out into space on the end of a lifeline to retrieve the cans of film that gave yet more precise maps of the moon's surface. He and his crew could look back on a highly successful mission.
It's been oxidized. Don't want to get the lunar sounder over here.
December 1972 brought Apollo 17, the last of America's moon landings. Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt did the moon landing and had an early lesson in 1/6 gravity conditions.
Stay there. Stay there. Okay, back. Thank you.
And we're taking a beautiful picture of Mother Earth.
I was strolling on the moon one day in the merry, merry month of December. No, May's the month. May, that's right. May is the year of the month.
And so spirits remained high, and the fact that this was the last mission seemed to push Cernan and his crew to greater efforts. Theirs was the most successful of the Apollo missions. They beat Apollo 16 records for moon driving and exploration, and they brought back the most rock samples, 113 kilos. This meant, in fact, that their craft was 18 kilos overweight. Their engines had to be readjusted before liftoff, which was recorded by the TV camera carefully positioned in the abandoned buggy.
7, 6, 5, port stage, engine arm ascent. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride. There's that one fader on there.
December the 19th, 1972, and splashdown in the Pacific Ocean brought the moon missions to a triumphant conclusion. But what information had it yielded about our satellite and space beyond? Back in Houston, specimens of moon rock are proudly displayed. They're part of the haul of almost 385 kilos brought back by the Apollo teams. There's no indication of any rich mineral deposits, no gold or diamonds, as some people had hoped. Basically, moon rock looks just like Earth rock, except that it's completely dry without a trace of water. Scientist Dr. Charles Simons gave us an expert's assessment on the moon rock's value.
What have you learned about the moon from what you've examined so far?
I think the main things that we've learned is that the rocks on the moon are very, very old. The youngest ones that were ever brought back from the moon are about 3 billion years old. That is essentially as old as the oldest rocks which have ever been found on Earth. And many of the rocks on the moon are almost the age of the moon itself, 4.5 billion years. I'm afraid that about all that the moon rocks would provide if brought to the Earth would be a large supply of gravel. However, the one great use for the moon may be because it is a very small planet and has very little gravity. And there are proposals being made by seemingly reputable scientists to mine the moon and build giant space stations, where what is useful about the moon is its low gravity. So it would take a very small rocket or a slingshot-like device to put something into lunar orbit and to use that material to build a space station.
Since the moon shots, the main efforts have been directed to orbiting the Earth rather than the moon. In 1975, Russia and America cooperated to do just that. This time, the two superpowers were not competing against each other. Two Soviet cosmonauts and their Soyuz vehicle linked up with 3 U.S. astronauts in an Apollo command module in an unprecedented display of space cooperation. It was handshakes all round, first between Thomas Stafford and Alexei Leonov.
How are you, Alexei? Won't you talk to the boss?
The two crews were to stay in orbit together for 2 days, 225 kilometers above the Earth. It symbolized the end of the space race at any price, which was becoming too expensive. The Americans Americans, as well as the Russians, began to develop a big orbital space station to carry out further experiments and observations. This is Skylab, a huge structure weighing 85 tons. The Skylab program was big too. Nearly 26,000 scientists and other workers helped to prepare for the mission. It was planned to send a series of crews up to the orbiting station for varying durations. They would study solar activity from their vantage point, while observations of the Earth would give more information about its natural resources and pollution threats, and about the crew members living all the time in comparative comfort. Skylab was launched in May 1973, and the first crew went up 5 days later. The huge workshop was visited by near disasters from the start. Vibrations from the launch tore off its combined thermal and meteorite shield, and this in turn ripped off one pair of the power-supplying solar wings, and the other pair failed to open fully. The three crews that lived in Skylab, one for a record 84 days, improvised marvelously to repair the damage. But when the last crew left in February 1974, Skylab was abandoned as useless junk. It could have stayed up for years, but its orbit kept shifting, and the world braced itself to be showered with blazing debris. A much greater return on investment is expected from America's space shuttle being rolled out here in September 1976. It's designed to be the first spaceship capable of being launched into orbit and then returning to Earth intact. In early tests, the shuttle rode piggyback on top of a specially converted jumbo jet. Throughout 1977, manned and unmanned flights attached to the jumbo were carried out, then a series of free flights and landings with crew from a high altitude. But technical problems mean the first orbital flight has been delayed. Several unmanned probes have been sent far out to planetary space by the Americans. These dramatic pictures of Jupiter were sent back early in 1979 by Voyager 1, beginning a 7-month surveillance of the planet and its moons. The pictures of Jupiter were transmitted back with remarkable clarity, and with similar probes to other planets, this program's yielding a marvelous return on the money spent. Another unmanned system of exploration is ERTS, the Earth Resources Technology Satellites. They are improved versions of earlier weather satellites, and the detailed photographs of the Earth are proving invaluable. They take pictures in the visible spectrum and also in the near-infrared. This gives information about resources beneath the surface, about the health of crops, about weather and pollution, and many other aspects of development and preservation of our resources. The flow of vivid pictures was immediately hailed as sensational by experts in the 50 countries taking part in the experiment. It has also been decreed that all ERTS pictures should be made available to the public at a price of only about $1.25. The project has proved an unqualified success, and in fact, many people see this part of the space effort as far more rewarding than the more glamorous exploits of the manned missions. One man who's seen both sides is astronaut Ken Mattingly, who in the past has walked in space, but who is now a top official at NASA headquarters in Houston. Mattingly is one of the few astronauts who have stayed on here. How does he look back on it, and what lies ahead?
I think that Apollo was the adolescence of the space age, and it was glamorous. It was something everybody could see and could get a real gut charm out of and say, isn't that something that I can look up, I can see the moon? You know, those are all tangible things that could impress everyone. Now we're down to the mature stages where we're starting to produce productive things, and we worry about things like what it costs to do things and making it cost effective in our efforts. And the real future lies out there ahead of us, and the significant work is yet to be done.
If Ken Mattingly is right, it could be another 10 years before space exploration finds its true course. Meanwhile, it is impossible to deny the effect of the moonshots on the imagination. The images of the Apollo astronauts and the pictures they took are still with us, records of the greatest technological achievement man has known.